Hi guys. Welcome to the end of week 2. I thought that I had at least given you the information to look at and did not do that. Did not publish any modules. Thank you for reaching out and being concerned. But yeah, so we have a module every week and I'm just going to go ahead and give you guys an additional week to complete this module. Um and just we'll do these two together. I'll go ahead and open this one. I'm gonna go ahead and no, I'm gonna wait for Bonnie and Clyde because I want to record my lecture for that. So this week we're covering gangs of the Wild West to a degree. I do have a document there over Tombstone. That's so gangs of the Wild West. So we just dealt with the pirates. Those are a public enemy that I think is very specific to pre-colonial or to colonial days and colonial American culture. Um, Despite the fact that most of these pirates were in fact from other countries, piracy, the golden age of piracy, was definitely an American thing because it was that triangle of the Caribbean with the Northeast, with Europe, like, and that whole democracy that kind of manifested itself on pirate ships, how they weren't the government, they weren't the corporations, they were there fighting against the government and the corporations, not justifying the violence and the thievery, but there's a little justification. I'm sorry. I've read the discussions. I agree with most of you, but there is a little justification for how the pirates acted. Not for the merciless killing, but the thievery, definitely justification. Um, and I'm tying it to today. When you starve people, people will fight back. People will take. When you are pressing young men into gangs to be in the Navy and they don't have a choice, that's the same thing as slavery. Like, so there is some justification for violence. Absolutely. Um, Absolutely justification to fight back against the entities in power that are persecuting you and like making it impossible for you to succeed in life. Um, there was some real thought behind that. Um, Now, whether or not that was their motivation, Charles Vane specifically, I they give him all these motivations in different in Black Sails, the show, but you just kind of have to wonder if he was just a bloodthirsty jerk. Like, um, so I love the motivations that the show gives him, and history gives him, and he gives himself historically. He claimed to be a Jacobite, where he was trying to restore Catholicism to the throne, when we all know, or we should know, Charles Vane was not religious, so it was kind of weird for him to go that route. But anyway, so moving on, Gangs of the Wild West, very much another more American um, entity, public enemy. And so the idea of public enemies, where we kind of talked a little bit in that first lecture, if you haven't read that, or if you haven't watched that, please watch that. But it's still, like I said, sorry, it's still a very American product, because most of these gangs came out of the Civil War or after the Civil War, where or during the Civil War. Um, the Civil War starts, the West in the 60s is kind of up in the air. We've got the Homestead Act, so we've got people settling out here in a very arid, not pleasant to live. I mean, you guys, some of you live here, area, and so there's not a lot of people out here. There's not a lot of law enforcement. We have a pretty significant chunk of civilization on the West Coast, Hispanic, and the gold rush in San Francisco that's developing out there. But the middle is pretty empty. From the coast to the Mississippi River, we don't have a lot of people, we don't have a lot of law enforcement. And so places like Kansas and Missouri where there are civilization, somewhat developed civilization, but still don't have the law enforcement, it creates an environment where these gangs can thrive. And I focus in on Jesse James, the James Younger gang, specifically because they're the most famous, and their story is definitely a post-Civil War story, and that's one of the discussion questions. So this is a heads up on the discussion questions. Um, um, Jesse James's Southern sympathies. Like, Jesse James was a Confederate. He was a Confederate soldier. Um, all of the people in his gang were former Confederate soldiers. The reason they were so successful was because they were protected by pro-Confederate sympathies in a lot of ways. And so one of the essay questions is how do Jesse James's Southern sympathies make him so successful when honestly everybody knows who he is at a certain point? Like, he's um, uh, kind of a like he's allowed to just kind of operate without law enforcement really messing with him in Missouri. And it's because people are still fighting the Civil War. I'm giving this lecture away. I'm so sorry. I'm going to go ahead and start the lecture, share the PowerPoint. Please look at the other materials that I have published on the module. I have only looked, I'm only talking about the Colt or the James Younger gang today. The Tombstone, I do have a document there on Tombstone. The Quantrill Raiders are kind of a pre video to the younger, or to the James Younger gang. And so please check that out because they will help with the discussion question. So well, let me share my screen. Okay. The James Younger gang. Okay, so Jesse James and his brothers and the Younger brothers, Cole Younger. If you've ever seen the movie American Outlaw, it's very, very not historically accurate story of Jesse James, but it has all the players involved. That movie, I love that movie. It's a funny movie. It's an interesting, it's a good movie, but it is not at all historically accurate. It's very much a good feelings kind of, yeah. Um, don't think that that is history. It's sort of history. But these guys, they were raised in what's known as Little Dixie, which should absolutely indicate that they are Southern sympathizers. Dixie is the name for the South. It's a nickname for our southern states. It was the area of Western Missouri. They maintained strong Southern sympathies, Western and Southern Missouri most specifically. Missouri was a border state in the Civil War. They were a slave state. They did not secede from the Union, but they were a border state with a lot of Southern sympathizers. And they were a slave state. So they were one of the 3 slave states, Kentucky, Missouri, and I think the other one was Delaware, that did not secede from the Union. And so they were slaveholding states, but they weren't part of the Confederacy. And I want to point that out because if you guys don't know, in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation only freed the slaves in the South, only freed the slaves in states who had seceded from the Union. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 did not free the slaves in Missouri, Kentucky, or Delaware. So I want you to resonate with that. Like, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free slaves held by the Union. So if that tells you anything about the motivations of, like, I'm not bashing President Lincoln here, but Lincoln wasn't against slavery to that degree. The Emancipation Proclamation wasn't passed morally. It was passed in order to demoralize the Southern states so that we could actually maybe win this war, because we were losing the Civil War. If you're interested in that, take my class in the fall. But yeah, the only reason the Emancipation Proclamation was passed or was declared by Lincoln, it was an executive order written by Abraham Lincoln, was to cripple and demoralize the South. It wasn't about morals, or it would have freed all of the slaves in the United States, not just those in Southern states. But we hadn't outlawed slavery yet. That's not, I know I'm getting on a whole other tangent, but we haven't, like, in 1861 or 63, the Constitution doesn't outlaw slavery. And so the Emancipation Proclamation really had absolutely no teeth. And that's why we had Juneteenth. That's why in the state of Texas, the slaves did not know that they had been freed. Even after the war, they didn't know that they had been freed, that the war had been won. And so Juneteenth, June 19th, is the day that slaves in Texas found out they were free. Enslaved people is the word I should be using. And so, yeah, sorry. So Clay County, the county that the James and the Younger brothers were from, had more slaveholders and slaves than any other region in the state. Missouri had 10% of the population held slaves as a whole, but 25% of Clay County held slaves. One of the things I want to point out is the James and the Younger brothers were not slaveholders. They weren't rich enough. These were poor farmers. And so the pervasiveness, the pervertedness of thought, it goes all the way down to your lowest farmer. It's not just these big rich people. Like, there are your lowest level white men defending the institution of slavery when they couldn't even afford to own a slave if their life depended on it. But during the Civil War, pro-Confederate guerrillas known as bushwhackers. So even though the state of Missouri did not secede from the Union, there were pro-Confederate sympathizers, or there were pro-Confederate sympathizers operating in Missouri known as bushwhackers. And the Quantrill's Raiders video talks about that. But one of the reasons that they're considered to be so famous and so successful is because there is belief that a lot of these stories get inflated and spread by Southern sympathizers who are looking at Jesse James and the gang as these heroes that are still fighting this war that will actually end. And they've got to figure out what they're doing. But let's go back a little bit to James's early life. Jesse Woodson James was born on September 5th, 1847 in Clay County, Missouri. He had two full siblings, Frank Alexander Franklin, also known as Frank, um, and then Susan Lavinia James. Um, his brother, Robert S. James, farmed in Kentucky. He was also a Baptist minister. Ended up becoming ended up moving to Missouri. He was a commercial hemp farmer in Kentucky, moved to Missouri. He actually helped found William Jewell College in Liberty, Missouri. He held 6 slaves and more than 100 acres of farmland. So he was actually fairly successful. But he died in California during the gold rush. So they weren't, I'm sorry, the Jameses themselves weren't necessarily destitute or poor farmers. I mean, their mother married a doctor, so I may have misspoke or may have been a little bit wound up about that. Um, Either way, they're not these huge plantation owners. And the Youngers were not at the level of the Jameses, which kind of, I think, creates issues down the line. He dies during the gold rush. Zerelda, which is Jesse James's mother, remarries and has 4 more children with a man named Dr. Reuben Samuel. I have tortured here because, well, we'll get there. One of the incidences that colors Jesse James's young life is Dr. Reuben Samuel getting tortured by pro-union people, people looking, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but this is actually a picture of Jesse and Frank James. This is a picture of the home. This is the gravestone, though I do not believe he's actually buried there. So the life, so yeah, bear with me on this lecture. The life of the James Younger gang. So while Jesse is the most public face of the gang, though it was likely that they shared leadership, the gang carries out a string of robberies from Iowa, Texas to Kansas, all the way to West Virginia. So I guess I've skipped some things here a little bit. I do have a video that I'd like you guys to watch that I think fills in some of this information before the war. Long story short, like I said, please watch the video. Civil War happens. James and his people, James is pretty young, ends up joining kind of towards the end of the war. Like I said, the Quantrill's Raider video will give a lot of this background. So I suggest you start with that. But they go to war, they come back, they can't find jobs. It's not a good place to be after the Civil War. And they decide to target the federal government's expansion into the West. So the trains, the stagecoaches, the military, the Indian wars that we still have going on out here. They're basically targeting the federal government, and they're claiming that it's in the guise of still fighting this Civil War. They're also trying to make money though too. So they're robbing banks, stagecoaches. They rob a fair in Kansas City. They often carry out these crimes in front of crowds. They ham it up for the bystanders. One of the things that the movie talks about is like people being like excited to be robbed by the Younger gang or the James Younger gang because it was a novelty. They made it fun. They didn't kill a lot of people. And so yeah, it was kind of a lighthearted thing in the beginning. In 1873, they turned to train robbery, which did get them start to get them more notoriety. They derailed a Rock Island line west of Adair, Iowa. They stole about $3,000, which I don't believe that number is correct. There's no way 3,000 equals 68,000. Um, so I'm thinking more, it's probably more like 6,800. I think I added an extra zero. But for this, they wore KKK masks. Um, the reason they attacked railroads is because they saw it as the symbol of a threatening centralization. And that was the whole point of the railroads, was to connect the country and give us centralization, and honestly give the federal government power in the West. Um, they really only held up passengers twice. And so it actually allowed sensationalists, writers, um, such as John Newman Edwards, um, to kind of create a Robin Hood persona. And that's honestly, guys, this Robin Hood persona is a theme in almost all of these groups of people that we talk about. Um, the pirates had a Robin Hood persona where they were taking from the East India Tea Company and giving to the people who, who the East India Tea Company were persecuting. Um, with Jesse James, and we'll learn more with Bonnie and Clyde as well, where they're stealing and then giving money to their family and friends, and helping people out when it sucks for everyone. And so it's a common theme. Be listening for it. Jesse marries his cousin Z in April 24th, 1874. They have two children that actually survived to adulthood. Jesse Edward James and Mary Susan James. They did have twins that died in infancy. Jesse Jr. ended up becoming a lawyer who practiced in Kansas City and Los Angeles. The Youngers. So Cole Younger's father was a Union supporter. But he actually got shot by a Union soldier from Kansas. And after that, Cole Younger basically sought revenge as a pro-Confederate or bushwhacker under William Clark Quantrill, which, like I said, you should watch the video. And one of the things that I want to point out here is some Younger families changed their last names to Younger with a J to avoid a family association with the gangsters. John Younger, one of the Younger brothers, there's three of them, I believe, dies in a fight with the Pinkerton detectives in 1874. And so Pinkerton detectives, they are, I'm gonna go ahead and upload a video about them. I thought I had, but they are kind of a player here as well. They are definitely a player in the movie. The guy who plays Pinkerton is pretty scary, well known. But I do have a video there. This video is only accessible if you're on campus or have the VPN. If you need that, I would talk to the library or to IT about getting that set up. Either way, I'm not gonna, this video is not required. The Pinkertons. So the Pinkertons agents, they get hired to track Western Outlaws, Jesse James, the Rio Gang, the Wild Bunch, which includes Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Pinkerton was a private security guard and detective agency. So they weren't government owned or operated. They were at times hired or contracted by the government. A man named Alan Pinkerton and a Chicago attorney named Edward Rook, I don't know how to say his last name. They were the Northwestern Police Agency, Pinkerton and Co., the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. It still exists. It's currently a subsidiary of Securitas AB. And so Pinkerton is still still active today, which I thought was interesting. Pinkerton claims to have foiled the plot to assassinate President Lincoln in 1861 in Baltimore. Lincoln ended up hiring Pinkerton agents to be spies during the Civil War, as well as act as personal security during the Civil War. They were used to break strikes a lot, which doesn't adhere them to the working class of the American people. These violent tactics ended up losing them government contracts in the Gilded Age. We're not quite to the Gilded Age yet. And so they kind of lose their government side in the Gilded Age. But during the 1870s, they were likely contracted by the railroad, who was contracted by the government to deal with. So they are still a strike. They're still operating as a security strike breaking organization today. They were actually had been called on to break the strike and find out ways. So they don't necessarily just go in and beat people up. Today, they would dive into the backgrounds of the strike leaders and find ways to use that against them so that they stop. The end of the James Younger Gang. So I know that it's a short document, or it's a short lecture that doesn't really have a whole lot of payoff, but the end of the James Younger Gang happens in Minnesota. The bank refused to cooperate with the robbery. The townspeople fought back. Most members were wounded. Bob Younger was unconscious. Jesse wanted to abandon him. Cole got mad. They got in a fight. Jesse and Frank went one way, and the Younger brothers and a man named Charlie Pitts go another. So that is the end of their, they are no longer associated with the other. What happens is the Youngers are slowed down by Bob. They're overtaken and captured, and Charlie Pitts gets killed. Cole, Bob, and Jim plead guilty. They avoid being hanged. They are sentenced to life in prison. In 1876, and Jesse is free to go his own way. One of the things, though, I do want to point out is this is also an area where the sources differ on this incident. If you'll notice, I said earlier, Bob was killed by Pinkerton detectives. Jesse, there's confusion over the actual murder or the death of Jesse James. I actually asked ChatGPT about it, and they got it wrong, or the internet, the collective memory of the internet got it wrong. And so it's kind of some of this is legend. And that's the other theme I want to point out with these kinds of things. Once we get to Bonnie and Clyde, technology and just mass historical analyzation has kind of allowed us to cut some of that myth. But with the pirates and with Jesse James, we don't have the historical sources to confirm everything. So myth gets to reign because we don't, it's not a, there's nothing to ruin the myth. There's no myth buster for the pirates and for Jesse James. And so a lot of this could be fictional or could be sensationalized. So they escape, or Frank and Jesse escape. They go one way. They end up moving their families to Nashville, Tennessee, where the railroad had very little interests. There was no need to build a railroad. We already had that in Nashville. And so it makes it easier to avoid Pinkerton detectives because the railroad is looking for them around railroad stuff. there, Jesse was extremely restless. He really wasn't made for the normal lifestyle, which is another very similar theme to these people that we talk about. One of the things that when we talk about neurodivergence and autism and ADHD, you have to wonder if some of these people weren't neurodivergent. Um, I'm once again not making excuses, but there's just such a similarity where they aren't ever going to be successful in a normal typical existence. And I don't know, there's a name for those people, and it's not a bad one. Some people go sideways and go the bad way. Other people can't operate in normal society, and they change it and they make it better, or they make it operate for them. Um, but these guys, I think, are examples of when it goes wrong. Um, and so, because I want to point out, like, these people aren't dumb. Like, Jesse James is a very intelligent man. Blackbeard was a very intelligent man. Like, you don't get to do these things without being insanely good. Um, we'll talk about Clyde Barrow, but Clyde Barrow was an extremely intelligent young man. He was an extremely talented young man. He just his general ability to get out of a scrape, to visualize an escape route, like, these people have extraordinary skills that they're using for evil or for bad. When you know history is made by, I think, those that use those skills for good, the good things. But anyway, sorry, I'm going off on a total tangent. Point of my story: in Nashville, as a normal dude, Jesse James was restless. He drove Zeke crazy. He raced horses. He gambled for income. They lost the twins. Jesse took it hard, kind of started losing his mind a little bit, started calling himself Dave, which David is the son of Jesse, and David from the Bible is the son of Jesse. Frank farmed hogs. He made cedar pails, not pals, made cedar pails. Really tried to make. He was married. Really tried to make up uh, a normal life. But Jesse grabbed another crew. They went back to robbing banks, trains, and coaches. He would flaunt these easily gotten gains in front of Frank, while Frank here is poor, trying to make an honest living. And here's Jesse, buying his kids everything that they need, and, his wife new clothes. And Frank gives in. They end up robbing an entity near Mammoth Cave, Kentucky. Frank was suspected. His wife created an alibi. Jesse ran to New Mexico and was there for the birth of his daughter. Jesse creates a new gang. In 1879, he returns to crime. They hold up a train in Glendale, Missouri, so he also returns to Missouri. These were the first in a spree of crimes, including the holdup in Killen, Alabama, and 2 more train robberies. These new gangs were not made up of battle-hardened guerrillas from the Civil War. The new gangs were younger men who did not serve in the Civil War, and they tended to turn against each other, or get captured because they weren't necessarily good. They were just people. Jesse also grew very suspicious of other members. He scared one man away. It was believed that he actually killed one of the gang members. If there's a movie called it's got Brad Pitt in it. Crap, I can't think of it. It's the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, I believe. So check that out if you get the chance. Local so they did return to Missouri. Frank ended up settling on to Virginia. James is in St. Joseph, Missouri by 1881. And so Frank's in Virginia, James is in Missouri. And I have here the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. So Jesse James is, this is a picture of this. So the backstory on this, Robert Ford had been working closely with Jesse James. He was a witness, I think, to some of these killings, and basically they had killed him and his brother had killed one of James's cousins, and they did not want him to find out about that. And so they were living in fear this whole time. And so Robert is actually kind of in the back of his head, I believe, planning to kill Jesse James really from the beginning, or at least having in the back of his head that this man may kill me. How do I deal with this? So with the gang nearly annihilated, James only trusted the Ford brothers, and it was fairly, like, the level of trust was still fairly small. Charlie had been out on raids with James, but Bob was a eager new recruit. James wanted the Ford brothers to move in with him and his family to be kind of muscle and protection. But by that time, Bob had already conducted negotiations with Missouri Governor Thomas T. Crittenden, planning to bring in the famous outlaw. He was wanting that reward money. So there were two motivations with Bob Ford. One, of course, was the reward money. The other one was the fear for the fact that they had killed Jesse's cousin at some point. He returned to the railroad. He expressed he had turned to the railroad. There was a $5,000 bounty for each of the brothers, and then a $5,000 reward for the conviction. So we're at about $10,000 here. That's an insane amount of money in 1881. 82, excuse me. On April 3rd, 1882, after eating breakfast, the Fords and the Jameses went into the living room. They were getting ready to go do a robbery in Platte City. From the newspaper, Jesse learned that gang member Dick Liddell had actually been confessed to participating in the murder of Jesse's cousin Wood Height, is the name of the cousin who got murdered. And he begins to become suspicious of the Fords that they had not told him about it. And so Ford said that he believed that James had realized that the brothers were there to betray him, and that he kind of gave himself up. So what happens, according to Bob Ford, which we do have to understand that, and we'll learn about this in the other module, Bob is the storyteller. Bob's the trigger puller and the storyteller. So how can we really trust what Bob has to say? What really happened in Jesse James's living room? We've got Bob's side of the story, but can we really trust the story of the trigger man? So, Ford believes that Jesse realized what was about to happen. He laid his revolvers on the sofa and then turned around and basically noticed a dusty picture. The different stories, either he was going to clean the picture or noticed that it was crooked and was fixing the picture. At that point, Robert Ford drew his pistol and shot an unarmed Jesse James in the back of the head. Jesse's two previous bullet wounds and a partially missing middle finger served to identify his body. And so Um, so yeah, that is the death of Jesse James. The Ford brothers surrendered to the authorities, and they were actually dismayed to find out that they were going to be charged with first-degree murder. So in the plot of a single day, the Ford brothers were indicted, pleaded guilty, and sentenced to death by hanging, and then granted a full pardon by Governor Crittenden. So they didn't necessarily get betrayed. One thing I do know is they did not get the reward money. And so the governor's quick pardon suggested that he knew the brothers intended to kill James rather than capture him. The people who were awarded the majority of the bounty were Sheriff James Timberlake and Marshal Henry H. Craig, who were the officials who were working with the Ford brothers. So they got the majority of that $10,000 bounty, or $5,000 bounty, because you can't convict a dead dude. The implication that the chief executive of Missouri conspired to kill a private citizen startled the public and added to James's notoriety. Let me be clear here. People were outraged by the death of Jesse James. He was very loved and supported in Missouri. And so people were questioning, like, oh, so the governor just basically had Jesse killed. And like I said, some of, like, if this seems open-ended and you have questions, you should, because there's missing pieces here. But all we have is the testimony of the Ford brothers. The end of the Fords. So, after receiving a very small portion of the reward, the Fords fled Missouri. They actually starred in a touring stage show where they reenacted the shooting. So they were part of like the Wild West shows, where they got notoriety and fame for this. The public was divided against the Fords and those of the opinion that it was time for James to be stopped. Charlie committed suicide after suffering from tuberculosis and a morphine addiction. Bob ended up operating a saloon, a tent saloon in Creede, Colorado, which so it's a mining site. Basically, he's operating a saloon at a mining site. On June 8th, 1892, Edward O'Kelly goes to Creede. He loads a double-barrel shotgun, enters Frank's saloon, says hello, Bob, and then shoots Bob Ford in the throat. He gets sentenced to life in prison. But he actually gets released because there's a 7,000 signature petition in favor of his release. So 7,000 people thought that Bob deserved to die 10 years later for killing Jesse James. And that he was actually pardoned by the governor of Colorado in 1902. And so wrap up. So, well, I need some information here. Jesse's original grave was on his family property, but he was later moved to a grave in a cemetery in Kearney. The original footstone is still there, though the headstone has been replaced. His mother, Zerelda, wrote, "In loving memory of my beloved son, murdered by a traitor and coward whose name is not worthy to appear here." His widow, Zerelda, died alone and in poverty. So not a real happy ending for Zerelda, for his wife Z. So Frank surrendered in 82. He was eventually acquitted and lived quietly and peacefully after that. He died in 1915. Cole Younger died in Lee Summit. He was paroled. Him and Jim were paroled. See, like I have here, I have Bob was killed by Pinkerton detectives, and then I have here that he died in prison. I think we can just assume that yes, he died in prison because those are like, and this is one thing I want you guys to realize. So one source claims that he was killed by Pinkerton detectives. Pinkerton's not going to admit that, and we can't prove that. So that's a source that we can be like, this source says that he died of tuberculosis in prison. There could be likely record of that. There's more likely to be a record that he died in prison. Now, maybe it's a cover up. Anyways, this is where we can get real conspiracy theory because we don't know. Do not take anything historically that isn't public record as fact because a lot of the sources that we get this information from are personal diaries, personal, like firsthand knowledge. And we as humans are not known for being super honest about ourselves. So if the history we're getting is from someone's, I mean, it's or you know, another thing that you have to worry about or wonder about is once people die, people don't say bad things about them. And once you die, you kind of, or the myth, the legend and the mythology grow around you because there's nothing but looking at your past and looking at your life and speculating. Um, and so it's kind of like when you lose your spouse, if you're married and you lose your spouse, even if you had a terrible, terrible marriage, now that he's dead, you're gonna defend him, or they're dead, you're gonna defend them like it's you're gonna create this mythical status of them in your mind. It's part of grief, but it's part of the human condition as well. Um, Jim and Cole were paroled. Jim commits suicide a year later. Cole wrote a memoir that portrayed himself as a Confederate avenger more than an outlaw. He only admitted to one crime, which was that bank in Minnesota. Um, so it was kind of interesting because Jesse James passed. They were absolutely part of this criminal gang, Cole and Jesse. In Cole's later life, he's teamed up with Frank again, but they're doing a Wild West show. So one of the things that comes out of this story is Frank James and Cole Younger start the Cole Younger and Frank James Wild West Company, where they do these tours. So Annie Get Your Gun, Annie Oakley, is associated with Frank James and Cole Younger. Like it's all tied together. In 1912, Cole becomes baptized, repents of his criminal past, and dies a few years later. I have my work cited here. This is just kind of a information where I got some of this information. I also read the book, The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. That's where I got a lot of this information as well. So I suggest you check those things out. I know this was long, but I just have this lecture on that, and I'll go ahead and stop that. I'm going to send out an announcement with some more information about the essay. So